Hi, it's Louise from Sincerely Louise, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to do the knit stitch. And yes, this is what knitting is all about, the knit stitch. There's another stitch you might have heard about called purl, but we're going to be covering that later in the First Time Knits course. For today, I'm going to be teaching you how to knit every stitch on every row to create a reversible piece of fabric called garter stitch. It's the same on both sides, and the edges don't curl, so it's perfect for really simple projects like my phone cozy. You're going to be knitting a long rectangle and then folding it together and sewing it up to make yours. In the book I have two different types of knit stitch available. That's the English way and the continental method. They both do the same thing, you just hold the yarn and needles in a different way. In this video I'm going to be covering the English method, but you can also check out my continental techniques. Before you start knitting, you'll have needed to have cast on, so if you haven't done that yet, you can head back to my last video where I'll show you how. The knit stitch is actually easier than casting on, and I'm about to show you why. First of all, cast on the amount of stitches that your pattern requires. Just like with casting on, pick up the needle with the stitches on in your left hand, and the empty needle in your right. Push the right needle tip through the front of the stitch on the left needle. Now this stitch will have a front and a back, and you need to go through the front, pushing the right needle from the front to the back of that stitch so it crisscrosses under the left. Then you want to take the yarn and wrap it around the right needle tip from the back to the front, so it's sitting in between the right and the left knitting needle. Does this sound familiar? Then, using your left index finger, push that right needle tip down and towards you so it catches the wrapped yarn and creates a new stitch on the right needle. The right needle will now be crisscrossing over the left. And this is where it's going to change from casting on. Instead of pulling that needle away, twisting it and putting it back on the needle, we're going to do something much easier. Place your right index finger on the top of the left needle tip and then slide that new stitch off the left needle. After knitting your first stitch, you'll have transferred it from the left to the right needle. Then you want to pull the yarn coming from the ball. Again, you don't want to pull it too tightly and you don't want to leave it too loose. Like with casting on, you want it that just right snugness on the needle. And that's all that the knit stitch is. I told you it was easier than casting on. And like with casting on, the knit stitch is all about repetition. So repeat the steps for your next stitch. Start by pushing the right needle tip through the front of the stitch, so that the right needle crisscrosses under the left. Then wrap the yarn coming from the ball around the right needle from the back to the front. Using your left index finger, push the right needle tip down and towards you so it catches the wrapped yarn, making a new stitch on the right needle. Then, with your right index finger on the top of the left needle tip, slide the new stitch off the left needle, transferring it to the right. You'll have now knitted 2 stitches on your row, and to knit the next one, repeat those steps again. Like with casting on, if you push the needle in, wrap the yarn around and then push it down but not towards you, you won't catch that stitch. So it's really important after you've wrapped the yarn to push the needle down and towards you so it catches the stitch. Then slide the stitch off onto the right needle. That's all that the knit stitch is, going into the front of the left stitch with the right needle, wrapping the yarn around the tip of the right needle, using your left index finger to push the right needle tip down and towards you, then sliding it off the left needle onto the right. When doing the knit stitch, it's really important to make sure that yarn coming from the ball stays behind the knitting needles. Knit every stitch on the row, repeating the steps. Here they are again. Push your right needle through the front of the stitch on the left. Wrap the yarn around the right needle from the back to the front. Then, using your left index finger, push the right needle tip down and towards you so it catches the stitch. Then slide that stitch off the left needle onto the right. And repeat for your next stitch. Push the right needle through the front of the stitch on the left. Wrap the yarn around from the back to the front. Using your left index finger, push the needle down and towards you so it catches the wrapped yarn, making a new stitch on the right needle. Then put your right index finger on the tip of the left needle and slide the stitch off the left needle, transferring it from the left to the right needle. Knit every stitch on your row up until the last stitch. Now I'm always asked by new knitters what to do with that last stitch, and it's a really easy answer. You just knit it like the rest of them. So knit the last stitch on the needle like you would the rest of your other stitches. Now I finished my first row, so you can see I've knitted all the stitches from my left needle, which is now empty, to the right one. And as a beginner, my first tip is just to check you've got the same stitch count that you had when you started. Then all you have to do is turn the needle around and it will become your left needle. So below you can see that first row that we've knitted. The empty needle will now become your right needle, so slide your stitches up towards the end of the left needle so they're ready to be worked. Sometimes new knitters can find it hard to know where to go into on the first stitch on a new row. Sometimes the yarn might be pulled up over the needle, so it can be really hard to tell where to knit into, and you might push the needle into the wrong part of the stitch. To find out where to knit on the first stitch of your row, just pull the yarn coming from the ball, and you'll see the stitch on the needle being pulled tightly. You'll also see it's above a row of bumps, so you're always knitting into the stitches above the bumps. This can be quite tough to see on the first row, so give the yarn from the ball a pull and you'll see that stitch tighten, and that's where you want to push your knitting needle into. Remember to push it into the front of the stitch. Like with the first row, you're always pushing the right needle into the front of the stitch. Another really easy mistake to do is accidentally grab the slipknot tail and wrap it around the needle tip. Even experienced knitters can do this, so always make sure that you're taking the yarn coming from the ball and not the slipknot. Wrap that yarn around your right needle tip and then using your left index finger, push it down and towards you. Then slide it off the needle. When it comes to knitting your next stitch, if you pull the yarn coming from the ball, it's just going to tighten the stitch on the right needle. So to find where to go into, you're just going above those bumps. So you can see those bumps there, and you're going into the front of the stitch above the bumps. Wrap the yarn around from the back to the front of the right needle, then with your index finger push that right needle down and towards you so it catches the yarn, making a new stitch. Then just slide it off, transferring it from the left to the right needle. Keep repeating this process for every knit stitch. You always need to make sure that you're knitting above the bumps. That's the most important thing. You can knit under the bumps, like I'm doing here, but what that's going to do is accidentally create a new stitch and a hole. If this happens to you and you notice straight away, you can unravel it. And all you have to do is pull that needle out of the new stitch that you've just added. Then pull the yarn to unravel the stitch. You shouldn't have to do this if you're always knitting above the bumps. Knit every stitch on your row. And as a beginner, you might have really big hand movements, so pulling that yarn around with your hand and wrapping it around the needle. And as you become more confident with knitting, try and make those hand movements slightly smaller. Now you know how easy it is to knit, you can start reducing those movements and it will make it a little bit quicker. As you get to that last stitch, knit that as per usual to finish the row. Then turn the needle round again so it becomes your left needle. And quickly count your stitches to make sure you've got the same amount that you cast on with. If you don't, you can use the mistake pages in First Time Knits to help you identify anything that might have gone wrong with your knitting. You can also see my How to Go Back in Time video if you need to unravel any of your work to a mistake that you've made. If you start your row and it's looking like this, remember to pull the yarn down so you can see the stitch that you need to knit into. It can be really easy to accidentally knit into the wrong part of the stitch like I've done here. So here I am knitting into the wrong part of the stitch. And what that does is it adds an extra stitch, so I've now got 11, and a hole at the start of the work. A lot of new knitters find that their work increases on the sides, and that's usually because you're knitting into the wrong part of the stitch. If this happens, just remove your needle, unravel the yarn, and pull the yarn tightly so you can see where to knit into, and push your needle through the front of that stitch. Wrap the yarn around, and using your left index finger, push the right needle down and towards you, and then off. And repeat this process for every stitch on this row. You can always rewind the video and see the first steps again if you've not quite got the hang of it yet. Just keep knitting every stitch on your row, following the same instructions over and over again. You can also use the photo tutorial on page 16 of First Time Knits if you need that extra help going through each step. And don't forget the mistake pages too, which will help you identify any mistakes you might have made when learning the knit stitch. Once you've finished your row, just turn the needle around, ready to work the next one. After every couple of rows, you'll start noticing those ridges becoming more apparent, and the fabric beginning to build. At the start of your new row, just give the yarn a little pull to make sure you're knitting into the right part of the stitch, and then you're off, so you're always knitting above the bumps on every row. So like we talked about before, you want to knit into the stitches above the bumps. A lot of beginners pull the yarn really tightly, so when you finish that stitch you'll give that yarn a pull, and it can feel safe to work with when you pull it tightly, but it will mean that the knitting will become harder to work with. So it might feel safe to pull it, but don't do that. Try and keep it like a nice snugness on the needle. This is the basics of a thing called tension, which I'm going to cover in project 2. So don't pull it too tightly, and at the same time don't leave it too loose either, because it's going to change the kind of fabric of your knitting. So here I'm knitting these last 2 stitches really loosely, and what you'll see is at the end of the row I've got some tight stitches and some loose ones, and it's created quite an uneven piece of knitting. So you want to pull that yarn to a just right kind of snugness for each stitch that you knit, because otherwise it's going to create an uneven piece of knitting. So I'm going to knit the row with my loose and tight stitches. The loose ones are really easy to work with, but if you knit really loose it's going to create a baggy piece of knitting. As I get to the tighter ones, they're harder to work with, and if I was to pull the yarn really tight again, the next row would be even harder. So try and keep your yarn at a just right snugness. Don't worry if your first piece of knitting is a little bit uneven. It's all about learning how to do that basic knit stitch, and things like tension will come with practice. I'll also be covering tension a lot in the next project, so once we finish this one we can move on to project 2, where I'm going to cover tension a bit more. Now I've finished this row, you can kind of see my stitches are slightly uneven on it. So once that knit stitch clicks and you know how to do it, then you also need that understanding of how loosely or tightly you're pulling your yarn. But like I said, that will come with experience. After a few rows, you're going to start seeing those ridges form in the fabric. And that's what's created when we knit every stitch on every row. It's that reversible fabric called garter stitch. I'm going to knit this row really quickly and then explain how you can read your garter stitch, which I do also cover on page 18 of First Time Knits. And like I've mentioned before, the more confident you get with the knit stitch, the smaller you can make those hand movements, and that will make you a faster knitter. I've just come to the end of my row and I'm going to turn it around and explain how you can read your piece of knitting. After every couple of rows you'll notice those ridges start to form in the fabric, and that's what garter stitch is known for, that reversible corrugated fabric. If you want to work out how many rows you've done, each ridge is 2 rows. So here I've knitted 6 rows, and that's my first ridge there, so that's 2 rows. That's my second ridge, and my final ridge is the one with the stitches above the bumps. So in total I've knitted 6 rows, so that's 3 sets of bumps. I know that I'm looking at the right side of the knitting because my cast on tail from the slip knot is on the left of the piece. So if I turn it around, I'm looking at the reverse side, so the wrong side. This doesn't really matter with garter stitch because it is reversible, but it's good to know for future projects. Now I've taught you the basics of knitting, so making your slip knot, casting on and doing the knit stitch, then you're all good to go to make your phone cozy. So you need to continue knitting every stitch on every row until you've made a piece long enough to fold over your phone. And once you've done that, you can head to my next video where you'll be finishing the project by casting off.